Hello everybody, so today is a very special day because it's the Kempston Breakfast Stout Brew Day, or the KBS Clone Brew Day if you want to call it by its proper name. So we've got basically a massive Imperial Stout on the go. The first Imperial Stout that I've ever brewed, in fact the first beer anywhere near this kind of ABV in terms of strength, so it's my first properly big beer. And yeah, it's going to be an interesting one because it's quite a complex recipe, lots of stuff going on, quite a long process. Let's get into it and see what's happening. Okay, so a little bit about this beer. I'm actually about halfway through mashing and sparging at the moment, so this has just got the batch sparge in it now. So I'm going to go back to the beginning of the brew day shortly, but before I do that, just a little bit more about the beer. So this is the clone recipe for Founders KBS. Now I was never really somebody who was like that into the idea of imperial stouts or really big beers, not so much because I'd tried lots of them and didn't like them, just because I didn't think that I was really that keen on the really big heavy beers. But Founders KBS is one of those seriously good brews that can really change your perception on a style, and once I'd had that, it was, yeah, basically actually a really good imperial stout is an awesome drink. So fancied having a go at doing it. A few of my brewing buddies online are also brewing this recipe. Jamie did it today, so his one is already done, and Chris Alchemist did his last week, I think. So hopefully they'll all be coming good about the same time, and we'll be sharing those and comparing the finished product hopefully. So that's something to look forward to, and they'll all be getting a nice aging for hopefully some point around Christmas next year, or this year even, because it's now 2018. So yeah, as I said, this is my first really big beer. I don't think I've brewed anything probably over about 7% and a bit before this one, so it's the first time I'm venturing up towards that kind of 10% region. And because of that, the recipe that's given for KBS that we have been using is kind of direct from the brewer, so it's on the American Home Brewing Association website. I'll put a link to that on the screen now and down in the description at the bottom. That's really good, loads of detail, loads of information. But in terms of the process itself, I wanted to look up a few things just in terms of how to approach doing a big beer. And these are some of the ideas that I've come across. I'm not taking any credit for these myself. As I said, I've never done anything of this strength before, so these are just some of the tips that I've found in books and online and so on. So one of the first things is about choosing the right yeast. Now this recipe recommends WLP 001, which is the California ale strain, and that's a good choice for strong, very strong beers because it's highly attenuative, so it will ferment it right down. You need a yeast that's going to be able to get you up towards that kind of 75-80% attenuation level or even higher, so that you can basically get it down to a reasonable final gravity, and it's not going to end up kind of sickly sweet with a really high finishing gravity. To help out with that, you also need to be careful about what you're putting into your grain bill. So the recipe for this one actually has very little crystal or caramel malt in it. So it's got some dark crystal malt in it, but only about 3% in terms of the total grist. You don't want too much of that kind of malt that's going to contribute unfermentable sugars and possibly push the final gravity higher. So malt selection and yeast are pretty key in terms of getting the FG down to a reasonable number and not ending up with a really sickly sweet brew. Following on from your yeast selection, really important you've got a really good healthy dose of yeast. So if you're using dry yeast, make sure that you're pitching a good number of yeast packets in there. So obviously it depends on the size of your brew, but don't expect a full size batch to be done with a single packet of yeast. You may want to put more than one in. If you're using liquid yeast, then you've really got to do a starter. even if it's a smaller batch, just to make sure that the yeast is up and running and healthy, and you've got a really vital yeast ready to pitch into the beer. So consider overbuilding the yeast starter as well. That's what I've done for this batch. And yeah, just basically hit it with as much yeast as you can when it's in prime condition, and it will help it again to attenuate down and finish the fermentation successfully. So obviously, I guess one of the main things that you're trying to avoid is a stuck ferment with these beers, because if it sticks in the middle, you're going to end up with syrup basically that you're not going to want to drink. And yeah, it's difficult to recover from that if you can't get the yeast going again. So as you've noticed, a lot of this stuff comes back to keeping the yeast healthy, making sure you've got a strong active fermentation. And one other thing that you're going to want to do to make sure that happens is having your wort well aerated, lots of oxygen in there for the yeast to work on. So it's going to need to work extra hard to get through all of those sugars. You need some good levels of oxygen in there to get it started. So if you have the facility to inject air or oxygen into it, then that's obviously great. If not, make sure that you are beating as much air into it as possible. I stir the kettle loads when I'm cooling the wort down. Helps to speed up cooling as well, which is an advantage, but it also, if you're obviously using a whisk or a slotted mash paddle or whatever, it's going to get air into the wort as well. So that's one stage of getting oxygen in, and then the kind of classic method of just tipping or pouring the wort from a height into your FV. So I will probably have the kettle up on the countertop and be filling the FV on the floor so that it's going in at a good height and you're getting loads of splashing. After that, you can also obviously shake it up in the FV as well, just to try and introduce even more oxygen. But even more important for the big beers, for your yeast health, that you're getting as much air into and oxygen into the wort as possible prior to pitching a yeast. Again, more stuff for the yeast health. It may start, because it's taking longer to ferment through the sugars, it may start to drop out sooner than you would normally expect, i.e. in terms of before the actual fermentation is finished. So giving the FV a gentle shake or swirl, like towards the end once it starts to slow down, just to rouse the yeast up and make sure that some of it stays in suspension, helps to carry on the fermentation until it's actually hit the final gravity, as rather than, you know, dropping out and stopping working before that. So again, just to help avoid those stuck fermentations. Okay, and last but not least, again, quite important in terms of yeast health, is fermentation temperature. So if you have the facility to control your fermentation temps, if you've got firm fridge or whatever, then great. And it seems that a lot of the suggestions are that you should try and keep the fermentation temperature at the low end at the start. So the yeast is probably going to be have a very lively initial phase of fermentation. You don't want it getting too hot, so the yeast can be generating its own heat as well, which you need to bear in mind. Don't want it getting too hot and generating off flavours and very strong kind of alcohol fusel taste. So keep it low at the start, but then consider ramping it up once you get towards the later stages of fermentation, just to help that yeast out and get it finishing off. Okay, and the last thing, which applies to the batch that I'm doing, is obviously think about potentially scaling the recipe down a bit. So the original recipe is for 19 litres. I've just scaled it down to 12 litres. First of all, because I really don't think I'm going to need 19 litres of Imperial Stout for next Christmas to get through. There's not many other people in the house or near family members who are going to be drinking it, so it will take a while to get through even 12 litres, let alone 19. But also it just makes it a little bit easier to deal with in terms of the size of the batch ingredients and how much space you need in your mash tun or kettle. I'd probably have been able to get a full batch into my mash tun and certainly the kettle easy enough, but it does mean that you're not dealing with quite as much grain and so on. So this has got about 5 kilos of grain, like a standard kind of batch size, standard strength beer in a bigger batch, but obviously there's just less water going into it, so we're getting a much stronger wort at the end. Okay, so that's the tips or the things that I've learned about doing big beers so far, so hopefully that will help some of you out. If you know any other things that are useful for brewing big beers like this, then chuck some comments in underneath, and yeah, hopefully that will help some other people out as well. Okay, cool. So let's carry on and have a look at the recipe. Okay, so the original recipe, which as I said is on the American Homebrewers Association website, comes directly from the founder's brewer. What's his name? Jeremy Kosmicki. Founders beers are amazing, by the way. They're one of my favourite breweries. Pretty much everyone that I've tried of theirs is great. Not just the dark strong beers either. All Day IPA, their hoppy pilsner. The porter is brilliant. I really like their porter as well. Give them a try if you haven't already. And as I said, if you're not sure about imperial stouts, try KBS because it's the bomb, basically. Anyway, getting distracted. So back to the recipe. Up on the screen now, you've got for 19 litres 6 kilos of pale malt. So straight off the bat you're starting off with a massive amount of base malt there. 680 grams of oats, 340 grams of roast barley. Then you've got a load of Belgian chocolate malt, 340 grams again, 227 grams, or I think that's half a pound of Belgian debittered black malt, 227, half a pound of 120 Lovibond crystal malt, so that's your dark crystal malt. And then hops, we've got Nugget for bittering, 28 grams at 60. It has a 90-minute boil, but you've got a 60-minute addition for the Nugget hops. Willamette, 35 grams at 25 minutes, and then another 49 grams of Willamette at 10. And then we've got some extra stuff for the chocolate and coffee, which is 71 grams of Belgian bittersweet chocolate, 42 grams of unsweetened cocoa nibs, both of those going in at 15 minutes. Flame out, you have some ground Sumatran coffee, 57 grams of that going in, and once it is aging in secondary, you also add some cold brewed Kona coffee, which is some very expensive coffee from Hawaii, and as well as that, some oak. So in this recipe they're suggesting some oak chips, which have also been added with a cup of bourbon. So you've got Kentucky bourbon, coffee, chocolate, a whole shit ton of roasted malts. It's you can see why it's such a good beer with all of that good stuff going in there. So my version of the recipe is going to have a few changes because of basically what I have available to me. So some minor changes. First of all, as I said, I have scaled it down. So this is for a 12 litre batch, and I've also assumed a fairly low brew house efficiency. I don't know exactly what I'm going to get. As I said, I've not brewed a beer this big before, but I've assumed a fairly low one because I have noticed in the past the stronger beers you do tend to see a slight drop in efficiency. Whether or not I've gone for too much of a drop in efficiency we'll see, but I'd rather it was over target than under target in this case. So I've worked on 65% brew house efficiency with a 12 litre batch. I have 4.45 kilograms of pale ale malt. This is the Homebrew Company's Minch Irish pale malt that I'm using for that. It's a good, fairly sort of neutral pale malt, so it won't really make much of a difference to the flavour, I don't think. 500 grams of oats, standard English chocolate malt, 220 grams, 220 grams of roast barley, and then instead of the Belgian debittered black malt, I've got Carafa Special 2, which should be pretty much the same because that's also a debittered malt, and then we've got, last of all, the extra dark crystal. So that's pretty similar apart from a couple of changes in terms of the Belgian malts that we've got there to the original. And then for the hops, I don't have any Nugget left, so I'm just going to use a different bittering hop. So Apollo is going in 19 grams at 60. I've got some Willamette, but not enough for the recipe, so the first addition at 25 minutes is going to be Styrian Goldings instead, but that's a Slovenian version of Fuggles, so, and Willamette is an American version of Fuggles, so not exactly the same, but it's going to be not too far away from that. Then we've got 44 or nearer 45 grams of the cocoa powder, so I'm going to use cocoa powder instead of actual chocolate in this one. I think the original uses like actual chocolate in there, but I know that can cause you problems in terms of the fats and stuff getting in, so I'm not going to use that. I'm going to use 100% cocoa powder. I have got the cacao nibs or cocoa nibs, so they will be going in 26 grams of those. And I did manage to find some Sumatran coffee, Lidl stock Sumatran coffee in their deluxe range, so some actual Sumatran coffee will be going in at the end. And yeah, that's it. So not sure what coffee I'm going to use for the last one, probably a Colombian coffee or something like that, because I'm not going to pay out for the Kona coffee because it's seriously expensive. I've got some oak chips, and I'll buy some bourbon, probably use either Buffalo Trace or maybe Wild Turkey for that, so it gives me an excuse to buy a nice bottle of bourbon as well. And that's what I'll be using. So yeah, that's it. California Ale WLP01 as the original recipe suggests, and I've made up a 2-litre starter for that, although a lot of it escaped out of the flask because it was a very lively starter. Right, so those are the recipes. Don't think I've got anything else to talk about, so let's get on with the actual brew day footage. Right, about 24 hours later since the end of that brew day. It was a long-asked brew. Took me the best part of 7 hours, I think, to get that done, but as you saw, it's in the brew fridge behind me, bubbling away now, just about starting to form a krausen, so fingers crossed it will all go to plan. The amount of effort and time that's going to go into this brew, if it doesn't go to plan, I will probably post up a video of me weeping over the loss of so much time and effort, but fingers crossed it will be a good one. And yeah, I guess I'll be reporting back on this one in about a year's time.
I'm the dude, so that's what you call me, you know? That or his dudeness or duder or, you know, El Duderino.